Hello, this is Tom Simmons coming to you with another installment of Economics with Tully. And for today's installment, we are on the Dingle Peninsula on the southwestern corner of Ireland, across the sea. I've spent the last 2 weeks in Scotland and England and Ireland, and this is a part of the world where I could write books and books on economic subjects, from the original Celts to the monasteries that were built that became the town centers and town markets, to the Industrial Revolution in Britain, to trade with the New World, to the clearance of the Scots from the Highlands, to the Irish famine, and up until modern times. And in fact, in many ways, these islands over here, Ireland, England, Scotland, are a microcosm for so many of the conflicts that have taken place in the political and the economic world, as we've had a clash of ideas, specifically as to what is the role of government in establishing or in helping or in aiding an economy. The subject of today's lesson is fiscal policy, which is one of maybe 4 different approaches that economists have taken throughout history to try and reinvigorate an economy that seems somewhat stalled. In Scotland, one of the fathers of economic theory, Adam Smith, said government should not really do much of anything, but should get out of the way and let economies work out their problems from the ground up. In Ireland has been known recently as a Celtic tiger because it went from one of the poorest economies in Europe to its fastest growing, not only in Europe, but in the world. And that was based largely on supply-side policies, which is a subject of another lecture of mine. But today we're looking at fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is really the creation of a gentleman named John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a mathematician, not an economist, and he served in the board of directors of the Bank of England in London, and he came into his own during the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s. And the history here is important, because during the Great Depression in both the US and in Europe, unemployment went through the roof. Up to 1/3 of all working people found themselves out of jobs. Prices had crashed, jobs were gone, and people were yelling for government to do something. Well, what that something was what Keynes came up with, and that's called fiscal policy, but it is so closely identified with John Maynard Keynes that it's often called Keynesian policy or fiscal Keynesianism. And from the Great Depression for the next 50 years, it was pretty much accepted in economic circles with very little dissent that Keynesianism was the way to go. So let's talk a little bit about what John Maynard Keynes envisioned as the government's role in an economy. Now, keeping in mind that unemployment was the big issue, Keynesianism is focused on creating jobs. And to Keynes, the key in reinvigorating an economy that was having trouble was in shifting aggregate demand. In other words, increasing the demand of goods and services within the economy. And this, he assured us, if we could create more demand for goods and services, that means producers would have to hire more people, and that would create jobs, and that would put money in people's pockets to purchase things, and that would reinvigorate the economy. Now, keep in mind, he's a mathematician, so he is looking at overall numbers kind of from the top of the economy. And he realized that in increasing aggregate demand, there were a number of mathematical problems to get through. The first is this. If the GDP of a country is, say, $10 trillion, and we expect or we believe that $12 trillion would be the right level to bring everyone to full employment, Well, that means there's a gap. That's called the GDP gap. And that would be $2 trillion, the amount between what's actually being created and what we think we need to create for full employment. But Keynes also understood that if you just pump money into an economy, yes, much of that will create jobs. However, a lot of it, because of the increase of dollars in the economy, will also be lost simply to higher prices. So he said you had to pump in more money than the amount of the GDP gap, and he called this the aggregate demand gap. That was the first problem. The second problem is that once a dollar gets spent, it doesn't stop. If I buy a craft that you made from you, and then you take that money and you use it to purchase the raw materials that you made your craft with, and then the person you bought your materials from then uses it to go out and buy lunch at the local diner, and then the diner takes it and uses it to pay their waitstaff, and then they take it and they use it to buy a bucket of paint to paint their house, you can see how this $1 multiplies over and over and over throughout the economy. And this is what Keynes called the multiplier effect. So actually, even though you want to maybe spend a little more than $2 trillion in order to fill that gap, you actually want to spend a lot less, because with each dollar getting spent, it's getting spent many, many times. So that was the second problem he encountered. And the third problem he encountered is something we call leakage. Now, leakage is a term, a derogatory term, really, that Keynes used to describe savings. He was very, very much against savings. So that if you got a $500 bonus check and you said, great, I'm going to put this away in my savings account, or I'm going to save it for a rainy day, he actually opposed that, because to him, this was buying power that was leaking out of the economy and no longer had that multiplier effect. So again, being a mathematician, Keynes worked out a whole series of formulas to decide how much ought to be spent by the government in the economy in order to bring us to where we want to be. Now, in shifting aggregate demand, he described 3 different tools that a government could use in order to kickstart this economy. The first was to cut people's taxes. He assumed that if you cut the amount of taxes people have to spend, then that's more money in their pocket and they can spend it on other things. And many presidential administrations in the US and administrations around the world have used that technique, giving tax cuts to consumers in an effort to stimulate an economy. The second tool he would use is an increase in transfer payments. Transfer payments, technically defined, are payments received by consumers for which nothing is required in return. So for instance, Social Security, which was coming into its own in this period, welfare benefits, food assistance, SNAP benefits, women, infant, and children, all of the government assistance programs that put money into people's pockets with the hope that they will then spend this money in the economy and increase demand for goods and services. And the third tool he proposed was simple, straight, direct government spending. If the people aren't spending enough money to keep the economy going, then let's have government do it. And you may have heard of things such as stimulus packages in the past. Previous presidents have actually used stimulus packages. And this is governments just deciding to spend money. It could be on roads, it could be on the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt had people building parks and planting trees and clearing fields. Any type of government spending, because that's guaranteed money going into the economy. Now, if you are increasing government spending and you are giving money away in the form of transfer payments, and you are cutting people's taxes. That should raise a red flag. How do you do that? How do you give away $10 and then spend $10 at the same time when you don't have any money coming in to pay for it? And so Keynes developed a system of deficit spending. He said, look, the important thing is to get the economy going again. Let's just spend money. Where do you get it from? You borrow it. Remember, this is a man who doesn't like savings. Borrow the money. Borrow the money and spend it. And he argued, from a mathematical perspective, as the economy gets better, the government can spend less and less, and then you can pay back the money you borrowed. And of course, this leads us to some of the main criticisms of fiscal policy. The first, of course, is this deficit spending. When the government borrows money, it doesn't just print money. And a lot of people use that phrase very, very carelessly. The government just prints money. They really don't. They actually borrow the money. They borrow it from major corporations. They borrow it from major banks, such as Chase Manhattan or Citibank or Goldman Sachs and financial houses. They borrow it from foreign governments. We borrow our own dollars back from China, from the Saudis, from other places around the world. The problem is that money has to be paid back with interest. Now, in reality, the actual money is almost never paid back. The principal is almost never paid back. If we have to pay someone back, we simply borrow from someone else to pay them. However, and that's why, by the way, our current deficit is over $20 trillion. To be specific, I should say our current national debt is over $20 trillion as a result. However, what does have to be paid back in a timely fashion is the interest. Because when the U.S. government borrows money from a bank, the bank isn't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They get paid back with interest. And that interest comes out of the federal income tax that the citizens pay. And that means citizens might like it when government says we're going to spend money and build something or do some project. But the reality is the citizens are paying for it because their federal income tax is going to pay the interest on the money that was borrowed from the banks in order to undertake that spending. And that means that deficit spending always represents a transfer of wealth from the citizens to the large bondholders, because that's how government borrows. It issues a bond to a bank. The bank gives it money in return. So that, of course, is a major criticism of fiscal policy, because you've got the situation where this money is being transferred from people to banks. The other problem, of course, is that Keynes envisioned that, well, when the economy gets good, we would simply pay this money back. That doesn't happen, because politicians are not economists and they're not mathematicians. They're not sitting there worried about what's the right amount to spend this year or what's the right amount to get the economy going. What they're more concerned with is, can I get money for a bridge in my district? Can I get money for a school in my district? Can I get money for a park to be built in my district? And so the government will spend the money, but they never reverse it. I mean, put yourself in this position. If the government said college education was free from now on, within 3 or 4 years, everybody would just assume that, well, my college education should be free. And if the government tried to reverse that, there would be protests on campuses and there would be politicians screaming and yelling, and it would never get reversed. So from a theoretical perspective, what Keynes suggested seemed to work. Just spend the money now, and then when money comes in later, pay it back. But from a political perspective, which is how this is carried out, it doesn't ever happen that way. So that's one major criticism. The second, the first is the interest that goes to the bank. The second is this political nature. It doesn't really happen the way Keynes envisioned it. And the third is that it sends false signals to the economy. If the government runs out and decides it's going to buy widgets and give everyone a free widget, Then widget manufacturers start hiring people and making widgets. But what happens when that government program, when the money runs dry, or when no one wants widgets anymore? Well, now you've got factories with widgets on the shelf and widget-making employees, and no one wants widgets. So now they have to lay people off. And now they have to sell widgets at a cut rate in order to remove what they've built. When the government steps into the economy, it's not a real indication of what people really want to buy. It's an indication of what government decided to spend money on. And so it creates this discordance in the economy between what producers are making and what people actually want to purchase. Now, in spite of those criticisms, in spite of a $21 trillion debt that the nation currently has, in spite of the fact that more of your income tax today goes to paying interest to the banks who lent the money to the government in the first place than many other important government programs, it is the single most popular go-to measure for every developed economy around the world when unemployment rises or when GDP falls or when people assume that there's a problem with the economy, which we call macro failure, and they want government to do something. For 50 years, from the late 20s, early 30s, up to the 70s and 80s, it was really pretty much the only major tool that economists went to. Things changed in the 1970s and 1980s, big time, but that's a subject of another video. So this has been a brief overview of John Maynard Keynes and fiscal policy and the interaction of that policy and your pocketbook. Tom Simmons signing off.